Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. In this episode, we're diving into the book Shakespeare and Company, written by Sylvia Beach, the founder of Shakespeare and Company, which is her memoir penned in 1956. Shakespeare and Company is located on the banks of the Seine River in Paris, facing Notre Dame Cathedral across the river. This little old bookstore with its green facade is considered a cultural landmark in Paris and a favorite filming spot for many art film directors, hailed as one of the world's most beautiful bookstores. Upon entering the bookstore, a motto on the wall catches your eye: "Be not inhospitable to strangers, lest they be angels in disguise." The store is packed with books, arranged in a somewhat messy way. On the second floor, there are sofas and camp beds, as the bookstore provides food and temporary beds for homeless writers. Since its birth, this bookstore by the Seine has nearly a century of history. Many art-loving youths, upon first arriving in Paris, make a pilgrimage here. Sylvia Beach, the author of Shakespeare and Company, was born in 1887, the daughter of an American minister. She appears in many famous writers' memoirs, described as a petite, humble, simple yet energetic woman. When she was 14, due to her father's job transfer, the family moved to Paris. Upon arriving, she developed an indescribable fascination with the city, beginning her bond with Paris. From then on, in her youth, Beach read widely and always dreamed of opening her own bookstore. She originally wanted to open a French bookstore in America, but the costs were too high, so she turned to opening an English bookstore in Paris instead. She said that although the whole process was fraught with difficulties, it was endlessly fascinating. First, Beach found a suitable storefront on Rue du Plat and then received all her mother's savings. This was the initial seed money for Beach's bookstore. On November 19th, 1919, with the support of her friend Adrienne Monnier, Beach's Shakespeare and Company officially opened its doors. Her naming of the bookstore was actually quite subjective. She felt Shakespeare was too famous, so she named the bookstore Shakespeare and Company. This bookstore, rather than just a business, it was Beach's life's work. She once described the bookseller's job as like a shoemaker finding the right fit for customers. It has to be just right. Unlike traditional bookstores selling publications, Shakespeare and Company functioned more like a library-style shop. Books weren't priced, no marketing was done, and people were encouraged to browse freely. It also introduced and taught American literature knowledge to French readers. By then, Paris had solidified its status as the world's cultural and artistic center, attracting hordes of American literary youth seeking their dreams. Most arrived in Paris penniless and down and out, unable to afford books or even rental fees. Whenever encountering such customers, Ms. Beach not only welcomed them sincerely, but also enthusiastically offered help. As more writers came daily to buy or borrow books, drink coffee, chat, and stay overnight, Shakespeare and Company grew lively, packed with distinguished guests, becoming a hub for Anglo-French literary exchange. Between WW1 and W2, a group of writers, disillusioned with American society, developed rebellious ideologies opposing established values. They were called the Lost Generation. Like Hemingway in Paris then, and Fitzgerald, author of The Great Gatsby, all were regular patrons of this bookstore. In 1922, Beach published Joyce's Ulysses, banned in both UK and US, instantly gaining fame and attracting more visitors. However, prosperity didn't last. Starting in 1933, the global depression severely hit the bookstore, causing Beach's business to plummet. Many renowned writers fond of Shakespeare and Company stepped in to assist or promote, allowing the store to barely survive. During 24, when Paris fell to Germans, A domineering Nazi officer demanded Joyce's work from Beach. Beach stubbornly ignored his demand for the last copy of Finnegan's Wake. The German officer then snarled he'd confiscate all her books the next day. Faced with this, Beach went all in, moving everything out with friends within hours. All books and photos inside, painting over the shop name until it vanished. Shakespeare and Company had completely disappeared in an instant. Thus, the stubborn Beach was imprisoned by Germans in a concentration camp. After release, Beach had no heart to continue operations, instead writing this memoir. In it, she chronologically details the bookstore's founding and growth, describes Left Bank Literati's anecdotes there, and highlights publishing Joyce's Ulysses. The book downplays the author's personal emotions, using conversational language to depict the bookstore's glorious era when literary giants gathered. To many book lovers, Shakespeare and Company remains an irreplicable, immortal legend. This handwritten memoir by founder Sylvia Beach finally recreates that legendary scene for us. As a memoir, Shakespeare and Company has fragmented narratives, focusing on Ulysses' complex publication while interspersing other memories. Next, we'll explore this memoir through two perspectives. First, the successful publication of Joyce's Ulysses. Second, the literary legacy of Shakespeare and Company. First, let's see how Ulysses emerged from Shakespeare and Company. Each's accounts of Joyce and Ulysses occupy over half the book, revealing her fervent admiration for Joyce and the work's profound impact. That Ulysses could be published at all proves Shakespeare and Company's indispensable role. James Joyce, a Irish writer and poet, exiled to Europe due to financial hardship, later hailed as one of the 20th century's greatest authors. In 1904, he created the short story collection Dubliners and novel A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Even before moving to Paris and discovering Shakespeare and Company, he was already gaining literary recognition. Joyce's most famous and controversial work remains Ulysses. It chronicles an ordinary day in the life of an ordinary man. Using Homer's Odyssey as framework, Joyce explores protagonist Bloom's Dublin wanderings, revealing his psyche while mirroring human civilization. Yet Ulysses' abstruse language, mixing archaic English, French, Latin, Greek, Arabic, made it notoriously difficult. Few initially recognized its value. Its explicit depictions of debauchery and lewd thoughts through criticism as vulgar and obscene. The modernist magazine, The Little Review, had 3 shipments confiscated by U.S. Postal Service for serializing Ulysses, deemed obscene. British printers dreaded Joyce's name. The book became outright banned. In 1920, when Joyce moved to Paris, he faced 3 urgent problems. First, finding shelter for his family. Second, solving survival needs. Third, completing Ulysses. Through poet Ezra Pound's introduction, Joyce met Beach. Even before meeting, Beach was already Joyce's devoted admirer. Learning she'd meet her idol, Beach felt both thrilled and terrified, almost fleeing. When Joyce finally appeared at the bookstore, Beach's recollection is precise and evocative. She wrote, Joyce walked up the narrow slope before my shop. Though shabbily dressed, his bearing was so elegant, his manner so distinguished. Her admiration shines through. She detailed their first handshake too. He placed his soft, boneless hand into my stiff little paw. Through her narrative, Beach reveals a talented yet quirky Joyce. Poor but generous, often overspending, merely blind from glaucoma, terrified of dogs, superstitious and acrophobic. Sweet-voiced, brilliant, athletic, fluent in 9 languages. Simply put, no one resisted his charm. Meanwhile, Ulysses faced serialization setbacks in Europe or America, devastating Joyce. He'd sigh deeply at Shakespeare and Company. Now my book will never be published. At this impasse, Beach asked, would you let Shakespeare and Company publish Ulysses? To her surprise, Joyce immediately agreed. Though Beach felt Entrusting this epic to her tiny press seemed reckless. Publishing her idol's work filled her with pride and excitement. Thus, risking reputation, finances, and experience, Beach plunged into publishing Ulysses. The memoir details this exhaustively, negotiating printers, designing blue covers, selecting fonts, endless proofreading, a mountain of troubles. Here we'll cover a few main challenges. First is funding. Beach wasn't wealthy. She could barely keep the bookstore running daily, but had no extra money for publishing. When Ulysses was stuck, her friend Adrienne introduced a printer named Monsieur Durantaire, who showed strong interest in publishing Ulysses and offered to handle the printing. Beach candidly shared her finances, saying she could only pay printing costs after receiving book deposits. And if no one ordered, the printing costs might go down the drain. But luckily, Monsieur Durantaire accepted these terms in the end. Second was the lack of staff. At that time, Beach was a novice at selling books, let alone entering publishing. Hearing about the staff shortage, a bookstore member named Miss Macy, a beautiful Greek girl, didn't mind the low pay or hard labor and decided to become her publishing assistant. This girl was great with customers, and her help boosted Ulysses' publishing work significantly. Then there was the rush in typesetting. Beach told the printer, "Let Joyce revise as much as he wants." Joyce revised insatiably. Even a third of Ulysses was finished on proof copies. Additionally, Joyce's manuscript was written with a blunt black pencil, filled with illegible symbols that needed decoding, causing delays and headaches for typesetting. I think for the first edition, rushed for time, over 2,000 typesetting errors appeared in the book. Printing errors, the publisher even inserted a small note in the first edition, specially apologizing to readers. Moreover, there was pressure from public opinion and distribution. After publication, Ulysses was still banned in America. To get books to American customers, Beach asked Hemingway for a crude plan. Friends smuggled books from Canada to the U.S. border, hid Ulysses in their pants, crossed by boat, each carrying only 2 books daily. This story became a joke for a while, overcoming many hurdles. Ulysses was finally officially published. Initially, Joyce suggested printing a few dozen copies, but Beach insisted on 1,000. The first 100 were hardcover on Dutch handmade paper with author signatures, priced at 350 francs. The next 150 copies used another French handmade paper priced at 250 francs, while the last 700 used ordinary handmade paper at 150 francs. Each mobilized extensively. Friends rushed to pre-order, and the expensive hardcovers sold out quickly. Recovering most advance payments, Ulysses' first pre-orderers included Irish poet Yeats, author of When You Are Old, alongside famed poets Pound, Did, author of the Pastoral Symphony, and Hemingway. Gide was the first French pre-orderer, while Hemingway bought multiple copies at once. Meanwhile, global orders for Ulysses poured in worldwide. On February 2nd, 1922, Ulysses officially launched. That day, coinciding with Joyce's birthday, Shakespeare and Company stayed packed from dawn till dusk, with Joyce celebrating with friends until cafes closed. Over the next decade, Shakespeare and Company reprinted it 11 times, showing literary fervor. Though Beach filtered emotional outbursts from her narrative, presenting Joyce as polite and amiable, but reading between lines reveals Beach's subtle complaints about Joyce. Why? Joyce constantly asked Beach for help. She wasn't just his publisher, but also his personal assistant, even his ATM. Beach specifically mentions Joyce's wife, Nora, in her book, a woman who avoided books, never bothering to open Ulysses. At mentions of writers, Nora would purse her lips. After Ulysses succeeded, Nora pushed Joyce to settle accounts with Beach immediately, demanding to tally Ulysses' profits, straining their relationship from early on. Then came copyright disputes, Initially, Beach and Joyce had no formal contract for Ulysses' rights. By 1930, needing legal proof against pirates, Joyce demanded a formal contract, which they signed. It declared copyright belonged to Shakespeare and Company. Yet, just 2 years later, Joyce contacted Random House, one of the world's largest publishers, via relatives to reissue Ulysses. Unlike traditional bookstores selling publications, Shakespeare and Company functioned more like a library-style shop. Books weren't priced, no marketing was done, and people were encouraged to browse freely. It also introduced and taught American literature to French readers. By then, Paris had cemented its status as the world's cultural and artistic hub, drawing crowds of American literary dreamers. Most arrived in Paris broke and down and out, unable to afford books or even rental fees. Whenever she met such customers, Ms. Beach not only welcomed them warmly, but also eagerly offered help. As more writers came daily to buy or borrow books, sip coffee, chat, and crash overnight, Shakespeare and Company buzzed with life, full of VIPs, becoming a hotspot for Anglo-French literary exchange. Between Double One and 221, a group of writers, disillusioned with American society, formed rebellious ideas, fiercely opposing old values, dubbed the Lost Generation. Folks like Hemingway in Paris and Fitzgerald, author of The Great Gatsby, were all regulars at this bookstore. In 1922, Beach published Joyce's Ulysses, banned in both UK and US, skyrocketing her fame and bringing more visitors. But the good times didn't last. Starting in 1933, the global depression hammered the bookstore, sinking Beach's business. Many big-name writers who loved Shakespeare and Company stepped up to help or spread the word, keeping the store barely afloat. During 201, when Paris fell to the Nazis, a bullying officer confronted Beach demanding Joyce's work. Beach defiantly ignored his demand for the last copy of Finnegan's Wake. So the German officer snarled he'd seize all her books the next day. With no choice, Beach went all in. She and friends moved everything out in just hours. All books and photos inside, painting over the shop name till it vanished. Shakespeare and Company had vanished completely in a flash. Sober, tragic, the stubborn Beach was locked up by Germans in a concentration camp. After prison, Beach had no drive to run the shop anymore. She just wrote this memoir. In it, she chronicles the bookstore's rise, shares left bank literati's quirky tales, and spotlights publishing Joyce's Ulysses. At that time, the Pounds lived in London and crossed the ocean to Shakespeare and Company. According to them, London was too humid. Staying there might make them grow web feet. In Beach's eyes, Pound's attire showcased British fashion of the time. Yet, he carried an American Impressionist painter's aura. Pound wasn't arrogant. As a leader of the modern literary movement, he disliked discussing his own work. The only thing he boasted about was his carpentry skills, always wanting to help Beach repair something, like cigarette boxes and chairs. Mrs. Pound was warm-hearted too. She feared people couldn't find Shakespeare and Company, so she volunteered to draw a small map on the back of the shop's introduction, guiding many customers and becoming precious early material for the bookstore. During his Paris stay, Pound extensively sought young writers and befriended European or American literary figures, striving to revitalize American literature. Pound assisted during Ulysses' first publication. He also helped Eliot organize the draft of The Wasteland, aided Hemingway in publishing his first book, and Shakespeare and Company provided a space for socializing, chatting freely, and growing, helping them immerse fully in literary creation. The second writer I'm introducing is André Gide, born into a wealthy French family. In his youth, he received strict home education, and due to his lonely upbringing, he developed a rebellious character. He was extremely dedicated to literature and music, with famous works like The Counterfeiters the Vatican Cellars, the Pastoral Symphony, etc., winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1947. Died was one of Shakespeare and Company's earliest members and always a friend and supporter of Beach. Beach's memories of this close friend are quite humorous. Guide enjoyed playing pranks. He once gave moldy chocolate left from last winter to children and laughed heartily at their strange expressions. He also told Beach about a prank where he and friends caught many turtles and secretly replaced the caretaker's pet turtle with a larger one. And they replaced it daily with an even larger turtle. The caretaker was puzzled, watching his turtle grow day by day. Then, Guide and friends reversed course, replacing it with smaller turtles until the caretaker was baffled why it shrank to button size. Who would have thought that an author writing serious literature could be so mischievous in daily life? Beach said Gide was actually very kind-hearted. When struggling young writers showed up at his door, he'd always invite them in for meals. In this regard, Gide and Beach were kindred spirits. Finally, let's discuss Hemingway, the renowned American author and journalist. When Hemingway first arrived in Paris in 1921, he was a literary unknown living in poverty. Armed with a letter of introduction from writer Sherwood Anderson, he found Shakespeare and Company. According to Hemingway's recollections, he felt timid entering Shakespeare and Company for the first time, but Miss Beach's trust and generosity warmed him. Hemingway wrote, "On a cold, windswept street, this was a warm, cheerful place. A big stove in winter, books covering tables, shelves and windows, photos of living authors on walls. Even departed writers seemed alive there. For this unknown youth, generous Beach found cheap apartments and introduced him to influential Stein and Pound. When Hemingway couldn't afford books, she waived deposits. Just register and borrow." In A Movable Feast, Hemingway praised Beach as kind, cheerful, and very amusing, adding, "No one was ever nicer to me." They'd share heartfelt talks in the bookstore. Hemingway showed Beach his scars, confiding past traumas, including his bleak childhood. Inspired by him, Beach took boxing and cycling lessons, deepening their bond. By then, Hemingway had started writing fiction, thrilling Beach immensely. She felt his writing was uniquely masterful, concise prose with endless strengths. Hemingway could be brutally self-critical but hypersensitive to others' critiques. Once at Shakespeare and Company, he saw British writer Wyndham Lewis's essay, The Dumb Ox, filled with scathing critiques of his work. Enraged, he knocked over Beach's 36 tulips. Though Hemingway later gave Beach a check for damages, he never forgot his grudge against Lewis. Still in the memoir, he says Lewis looked vicious, his face like a toad, his eyes like a failed rapist. At the end of the work, Beach concludes with the story of Hemingway liberating Rue de l'Odéon. As the memoir's conclusion, World War II was nearing its end. Paris was on the eve of liberation. Gunshots echoed on Rue de l'Odéon as a jeep approached from afar. It stopped at Beach's door. The crowd erupted in shouts. "It's Hemingway! It's Hemingway!" Beach dashed down the stairs and collided into Hemingway. He was seen wearing a military uniform, covered in blood. He lifted Beach up, spun her around, and kissed her passionately, while people on the street and in windows cheered loudly. Afterwards, Hemingway led his troops up to Beach's roof to deal with the Nazi snipers. Brew. With the final gunshot, Rue de l'Odéon was liberated. Hemingway descended from the roof, got into the jeep, and roared away. This depiction is thrilling, yet abruptly ends, becoming the book's final image. Even at its end, Shakespeare and Company remained a resounding legend. Ordinary bookstores see common folk, but Shakespeare and Company hosted renowned figures. The reasons lie not only in the owner's charm and the shop's unique features, but also in indispensable historical factors. Before 201, Paris had become a global cultural hub. attracting interest from the English-speaking world and literary writers. Shakespeare and Company could be said to have emerged at the right time, becoming a gathering place for English writers new to France. Simultaneously, many French writers, out of curiosity about Anglo-American literature, became regular patrons. During an era of shifting social ideologies, Shakespeare and Company nurtured the lost generation. After the war, Europe's international status and influence declined. With America's rise, Shakespeare and Company's success became hard to replicate. Shakespeare and Company is not a dull biography. In the book, the great writers of the early 20th century seem like ordinary people, making appearances one by one. Shakespeare and Company was Joyce's publisher, Hemingway's library, Fitzgerald's cafe, and countless wandering writers used it as their mailing address. French writer Chanson praised Beach as a pollen-spreading bee, facilitating smooth exchanges among writers, an effect far surpassing grand international events. For Beach, Shakespeare and Company was more like an ideal way of life. As he said, here lies all the passion born from books and sustained for them. In 1951, Sylvia Beach authorized American George Whitman to reopen Shakespeare and Company at its original location. George called his little shop a socialist, utopian republic disguised as a bookstore. During Whitman's management, the bookstore sheltered about 4,000 people in need, including literary giants such as Samuel Beckett, author of Waiting for Godot, Allen Ginsberg, author of the poem Howl, and James Baldwin, a Black novelist, among others. To honor the memory of Ms. Beach, George Whitman named his only daughter Sylvia. Sylvia Whitman took over the bookstore after her father's death during the 2015 Paris terrorist attacks. It became a temporary refuge for 20 strangers. Because Shakespeare and Company's tradition is to be a safe haven for many, a warm place to escape reality. Today, Shakespeare and Company still stands by the same river, continuing the spirit of an independent bookstore, welcoming literary enthusiasts from around the world. If you have a chance to visit Paris, do step into this little bookstore and experience it firsthand. You might have unexpected rewards. All right, that's all for our interpretation of Shakespeare and Company. The keynotes are below the audio, and we'll see you tomorrow.